And some more chairs are coming.
That's okay.
Yeah.
We're brave.
We can listen while standing.
Okay. Yeah, we made a little more space for chairs. So welcome to this gallery talk about the War of 1812. I'm really pleased to see so much interest in the War of 1812. When I started this exhibit, which we were doing because it is the bicentennial of the War of 1812, and as the Portsmouth Historical Society, I felt it was our responsibility to do something to honor that occasion. And along with the Portsmouth Athenaeum doing a lecture series, and the Portsmouth Marine Commission sponsoring some lectures about the subject, I think the subject of the War of 1812 in Portsmouth is going to be quite nicely covered. And it is definitely rewarding that there's so much interest in it. I'm Sandra Rux. I'm the curator here for the Portsmouth Historical Society and the curator for the exhibit. And so I'm going to talk about the war as it affected Portsmouth. I'm not going to talk about remote battles. You can actually go into our carriage house, which is where the restroom sign is, and we have a series of panels there, 6 panels that cover the entire War of 1812, and they are from the United States Navy Museum in Annapolis. They come to us courtesy of John Mayer, who's the director at the Albacore, because they sent them out to various maritime museums, sort of totally forgetting that John Paul Jones should be on that list. But so John Mayer and the Albacore got several sets of them because he was willing to distribute them. He had Fort McClary set and the Albacore set and so on. So anyway, those come courtesy of the Albacore. And if you want to know sort of a summary in 6 panels of the War of 1812, they're out in our carriage house. So this really deals with Portsmouth. And the War of 1812 was a really troublesome time for Portsmouth. First of all, you have your commerce is cut off, so your regular means of support for the maritime community are cut off. On the other hand, you have the Navy Yard growing, and you have privateering springing up to take the place of regular commerce. The political opinion in the town was divided. We had 2 newspapers in town at the time. The Portsmouth Oracle, which was vehemently pro-peace, and we have the New Hampshire Gazette, which was the establishment paper. Those of you who read the Gazette today will know that it has changed its opinions radically. And the present publisher would probably not be happy to have the Gazette described as the establishment paper, but that's what it was. The Gazette even published a paper for a year called the War Journal, which was the intent was to have an unbiased view of the war, which essentially was pro-war. So people in Portsmouth had plenty of news as to what was going on in the country. So when war was declared in 1812, in June of 1812, 2 days later, the Portsmouth Oracle announced, "War, horrid war." That pretty well defines their position. 2 days later, when the Gazette came out, they said, in a much calmer way, that the injuries done America by the British are now being addressed. So they're calmer, but they're definitely pro-war. You have a privateer launched almost immediately. The Nancy goes out in the summer of 1812, has sudden success, captures a prize, comes right back into port, sells off the prize, and that encourages more people to go privateering. Only 6 of the privateers made money. The privateer ships made money. And the other ships either were lost or didn't get sufficient prizes to cover the cost of privateering. And there's a list over here in the exhibit of the 16 ships that were privateering out of Portsmouth through the period of the war. The chief among the captains and owners of the privateers, successful ones, was Abraham Shaw. And Abraham Shaw is right there. Most of you can see him. In a fairly bad portrait attributed to Samuel F.B. Morse. If I were Samuel F.B. Morse, I would not want that portrait attributed to me. But it's been overpainted and cleaned and altered, and it may not have been a good portrait to begin with. But we have another Samuel F.B. Morse in the dining room of Joseph Haven that is quite a lovely portrait. So, sort of, you have to make of it what you may. But anyway, Abraham Shaw and his brother was Thomas Manning Shaw. Abraham stayed on shore, and he ran the counting house, got in other investors, organized the ships getting ready, and Thomas Manning Shaw is the one who actually captained the ships. And he went out, and the objective were British merchant ships, and you would capture the ship, bring it back in, sell it off what was on the ships. And the Thomas Manning Shaw also had incredible luck because he chose not to go on the last voyage of the privateer Portsmouth. The privateer Portsmouth had had several successful voyages and was viewed as a really profitable ship. However, on its last voyage, which left in November of 1814, it was never heard from again. And it was the only one of its voyages that Thomas Manning Shaw was not on. So it was, good fortune. So some of this, success and lack of success was luck, pure and simple. We have the privateers who are making up some of the difference of commerce, although calculations that have been done, and those who are more interested in pursuing the subject in depth can look at Wealth and Honor, which is the book which Richard Winslow wrote in the 1990s, and we do have it for sale here still if you're seriously interested in the topic. And it deals with the privateers in the American Revolution and the War of 1812, some of the similarities and differences between them. You're still minus a lot of money in the town. And then you have the Navy Yard coming in. The Portsmouth Naval Shipyard had been founded in 1800. Before that, we were building ships for the Navy. The ship in our signature portrait here is the Congress, and we don't know when that was painted or who painted it. And it was built here in 1799 on Badger's Island at Badger's Shipyard for the Navy. In 1800, the Navy Yard was founded. And not a lot happened there between 1800 and 1812. I read a couple of reports that said that the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard was the worst one in the country of the 6 or so shipyards that had been designated. That if you wanted to get your ship overhauled, take it to Philadelphia, take it to Baltimore, take it to New York. Don't bring it to Portsmouth. So that was an opportunity for increasing the size of the naval shipyard and its importance. It was far north, so it was at first less subject to some of the blockades that basically Baltimore got bottled up because of the Chesapeake Bay. New York got a lot of attention. So coming up to Portsmouth to refit ships was, they were more likely to be able to get out. Although Congress came in here to get refitted in 1813 and didn't leave again until after the war. It was getting refitted, then it seemed to have been blockaded in, and then it was, Isaac Hull wanted it to be kept here to protect the 74. So the 74, and this little case talks about the Navy here. We have Isaac Hull, who played a part in both getting the nickname of Old Ironsides for Constitution. The Constitution got into a battle with Guerriere, which is a British warship, in August of 1812, and handily beat the Guerriere. And the British observed that the cannonballs were bouncing off the sides of the Constitution, and that's how it got the nickname of Old Ironsides. Apparently, the oak our ships were built of was sturdier than the oak of some of the British ships. So at any rate, it was viewed as a very lucky and sturdy ship. Isaac Hull was the commander. He was somewhat off on his own in this battle. He was supposed to be with Commodore Rogers' squadron. He was supposed to go and catch up with Commodore Rogers' squadron, which is out looking for a West Indian convoy to capture to get supplies for the Army and Navy. And he left port before he could get those orders on purpose. And he was out patrolling off of sort of more the northern U.S., and that's how he got the Guerriere, and was covered in glory, and they came into New York Harbor. Commodore Rogers, who had the Congress with him, and they had captured 4 little ships on their big foray out into getting the convoy. And so Commodore Rogers and all of his ships come into the harbor at the same time as the Constitution. They're all sailing up the harbor this is in New York, and then they went to Boston. But at any rate, they all come in, and it's the Constitution that's getting all the glory, obviously. But Winslow credits Commodore Rogers with having, and Winslow and others, with having allowed all of the U.S. merchant ships, because he was diverting the British ships by chasing the convoy. All of the British merchant ships were then, the American merchant ships were able to get home safely from the West Indies and other places where they were, so that the fact that the U.S. fleet was out there in kind of unknown places made the Navy concentrate on those and not on our merchant fleet. So probably the merchant fleet getting home was really more important to the economy than was the Battle of the Constitution and Guerriere, but Constitution and Guerriere was far more important in propaganda value, in like sort of building for the popularity of the war and the Navy. It also had a role to play in the presidential election of 1812. James Madison had been for his entire career against the Navy, and the fact that the Constitution and the Guerriere was a successful battle, and that Rogers was able to save the merchant shipping, Madison had to use the Navy victories as a reason to re-elect him in 1812. So he had to sort of, eat crow here. That the Navy is important and can succeed. So we have some interesting things with the Constitution and the Guerriere. We have a wooden leg in the case up here, and the name of this leg is Uncle Dunn's Sunday Leg. And it belonged to Richard Fletcher Dunn, and with the Constitution people, we've recently done some successful research on the life of Richard Fletcher Dunn. It was given to us by Susan Ricker Knox, who many of you know as a painter. She was a 20th century painter, and born here in Portsmouth, lived part of her life in Portsmouth. But her great-great-uncle by marriage was Richard Fletcher Dunn, and which is how we got this leg. And Richard Fletcher Dunn came to Kittery with Isaac Hull. Apparently, Isaac Hull kind of kept him with him after he was wounded on the Guerriere. And in the Constitution Museum, they use Richard Fletcher Dunn's leg getting cut off as their surgery part of their exhibit. So all the kids who go to the Constitution see that this leg is getting cut off. And so they're really excited that we have the wooden leg, and they came up to visit it. The educator from the Constitution, Matthew Brinkle, he said, holding Richard Fletcher Dunn's leg is one of the most exciting moments in the last few years. Because he's been working on these crew biographies of the people in the Constitution. Richard Fletcher Dunn he'd come to this country in 1807. He was born in England. 1809, he got one of the certificates saying he was born in America from Pennsylvania, saying he was born in Pennsylvania. So that's been confusing about him all along. So he had the certificate, so he could go after the embargo ended. Jefferson's embargo was 1807 to 1809. He went to sea on the merchant ship. 1812, when war broke out, he joined the Navy. And joining the Navy, it was like 2 months later he was wounded and lost his leg. And so with Isaac Hull, he stayed in the Navy, worked on shore most of the time, at the Kittery Navy Yard. He appears to have been a bosun. He had the rank of a gunner, and he was apparently quite colorful character in the neighborhood. There's some surviving letters, and he gave an interview to the Portsmouth Journal in 1860 saying he was awaiting orders. Now, in 1860, he's 72 years old. He's still in the Navy. He was still in the Navy when he died in 1863 at the age of 75. So, a devoted Navy person. So we have his leg. It's one of our great stories. But meanwhile, the work they were doing at the shipyard was to build, they decided to build one of the ships of the line, a 74-gun ship here in Portsmouth. And we have a picture of the launching of the Washington, because that's the name it originally, after it was called the 74 for 2 years, they named it the Washington, and John Blood painted a painting, which is like a very nice, lovely, large painting that we had here, and we had our Blood exhibit. It belongs to Historic New England, so we have a little copy of it down there. And this was the first large ship built at the Portsmouth Navy Yard. And it took about a year and a half to build it. Isaac Hull built a ship house for it, when you can see it being launched out of the ship house. And that allowed work to go on in the winter. And he had about 100 people, then he got 30 more people advertising that he could provide work at good wages undercover. So that it's a good thing in January when you're working on a ship here to be undercover. And it allowed them to complete the ship faster. Put in perspective, the Independence got finished first, and in Sackett's Harbor, up in New York, they built a whole frigate in something like 80 days. So it wasn't the fastest ship ever built, but by Portsmouth standards, it was built quite rapidly. Hull had problems with his shipbuilders. Badger, he had hired the Badgers to start with, from Badger Island to come over to the shipyard to build this ship. And he said one of the Badgers was too old to do anything, and the other one drank too much. So it was not speaking favorably of them. And John Langdon had actually had some similar trouble with the Badgers a generation earlier. So anyway, he got new people to build the ship and hired people. And that provided some employment. It was a steadying force to the Portsmouth economy. I have two conflicting ads up there. One, the 74, the Peace Party felt that because it was an election year, that's why, this is for the 1813 governor's election, that they were promising federal money for the ship, and that it was not going to come to pass. It wasn't ever going to happen. It was just an election promise, so don't vote for those rats. And then the other ad that was on the same page of the paper, it says, we want this much wood, we want these pieces of wood for the ship timbers. So there was an ad out for the ship timbers. And you were supposed to bring your, go talk to the Navy agent about the ship timbers, supplying them. And the Navy agent at the time was Henry Sherburne Langdon, Jr., Henry Sherburne Langdon, who was the son of Woodbury Langdon, who actually lived in this house for about 20 years. And he apparently spent part of his fortune paying off for some of this that the government never reimbursed. So that is more family tradition than actual government record. But it's likely because they were having trouble getting money from the government to pay for the ship and the workers to pay for it. So that is sort of the story of the Navy Yard during that time. Meanwhile, you've got the Navy and the privateers all working in the traditional shipping mode here in Portsmouth. You've got people like Samuel Larkin, who built a brick house on Middle Street in 1815. Samuel Larkin is auctioning off all the privateer goods, and it is far more profitable to auction the goods that come in on the ships than it is to actually be a privateer, because if you are the auctioneer, you get a commission, and you don't have much risk involved. So Samuel Larkin, who had been an auctioneer before the war, had made a vast fortune and kept it after the war although he did later lose his fortune in 1827 in a panic. There was a panic in 1827 when he lost his money and had to move out of his brick house back to his old white wooden house. But Samuel Larkin he had built his new brick house right next to his old house, and he had something like 20 children, and to support, and eventually in 1850s you find some of his daughters running the white wooden house that they had moved back to as a boarding house. And that's sort of the last of the Larkins here in Portsmouth. As far as I know, there might be some still, but so you have people like Larkin making a fortune. You have other people who are doing quite well in ways that were not directly attached to the maritime trade. You have James Rundlet. James Rundlet's one of the most successful merchants of the time. He was in dry goods, which is cloth and that sort of thing, before the war. He obviously had been making money before the war because he built his fancy house, which is now the Rundlet May House, in 1806. He consolidated his earnings during the war period. He was selling supplies, woolens and so forth, to the government for uniforms. Always a profitable business to be in. And Rundlet he was one of the earliest investors in Portsmouth in factories, woolen factories, in Amesbury, the first ones that he invested in. So he was pursuing, he had gone from importing everything from England to pursuing American manufacturers. And that was kind of the basis of the rest of his fortune. There's a very interesting ad over here that Rundlet had. This is just before the war broke out, where he advertises English goods. Now, the embargo was over, but there was the Non-Intercourse Act, and trading with England was pretty well forbidden because they weren't recognizing our trade. And so he had, in his ad, imported into Halifax these English goods, then to Eastport, and then to York, and then to Portsmouth. So he has imported his goods from England to Halifax, which is perfectly legal because Halifax is part of Canada. The main inspector was Eastport. Any of you been to Eastport? It's still kind of way out there in Maine, and Eastport was always a haven for smugglers, and the legal apparatus there was perfectly willing to take these things from Halifax. So it went to Halifax and came down to York and then to Portsmouth. So Rundlet had cleverly worked his way around, and some of the other merchants as well. It's sort of an example of how you had to deal with trade in this very troublesome time where the laws changed every year. You never knew who was at war with whom, and what your own government was going to do to either help or hinder you. We complain today sometimes, but the environment faced from 1790 to about 1820 was just really unpredictable, and with Europe all in war, Denmark was blockading for a while, France had blockades, England had blockades, and you just sort of had to use your network to find out where you could send your goods. So we give people like James Rundlet lots of credit for circumventing all of the rules and making a fortune. The other person who did very well in Portsmouth here is Langley Boardman. Langley Boardman was a cabinet maker. He was the preeminent cabinet maker in Portsmouth in the late part of the 18th century, early 19th century, and he had some good luck. He had some good luck too. He made money making furniture. Originally it was on Pleasant Street, then he was on Congress Street. Neither of the places where he was were in any of the fires. So first of all, he has the good luck of not having his business burned out in the fires. Then there were people who were burned out in the fires. And while a lot of the furniture was rescued from the fires, there was a need for furniture. Then you had these people making money in the sort of boom and bust of the early 19th century, and the privateer people making money. And they're building big fancy new houses, and they need furniture. So Langley Boardman has a good market for his furniture here in Portsmouth. He uses profits to invest in real estate. His house right over here on Middle Street was built in 1804. He didn't live in it for about 10 years. He rented it out until he felt he could afford to live in it. He sold off, he had bought a big chunk of land, and he sold off lots to his workmen, who paid him for the lots by doing work in Langley's house, as well as doing work in the furniture factories, or furniture workrooms. I wouldn't exactly call them factories at that time. So Langley Boardman was quite clever. He also had the good fortune to invest in the profitable privateers, and he made a significant amount of money on a couple of the privateer ships, and then kind of stopped investing in them. So he did well for several reasons, and came out of the War of 1812 era very wealthy. And unlike Samuel Larkin, he didn't lose his money in the Panic of 1827, or the family didn't. He's one of our successes. I'd also like to mention some people who were less positively impacted by the war, because for the shopkeepers, the small shopkeepers, it was a very difficult time. Your supply of goods was really limited, and your supply was dependent upon what they captured with the privateers. You might have a ship they captured that had a whole bunch of flour on it. You might have another ship that had, thousands of pieces of cloth. There appears to be a lot more cloth, very little crockery coming in on these ships. It appears to be lots of cloth that they were capturing, and they needed food supplies and things like that, but not so good for the local merchants to sell. You could sell them off to the Navy and Army and things like that, but like how much flour do you need in Portsmouth? So uncertainty of supply. You had who's going to buy it, because lots of the people in town don't have money, and so it's just, as they say, business was dull for the entire period. I mean, they're very quiet about how awful business was. And so we have people like Henry Sherburne Langdon, who was the Navy agent, who presumably lost his money supplying funds for the Navy. But he also, if you look at the records, he made some very bad business decisions and was busy losing his fortune before the war. I think Edmund Roberts, who lost a lot of his fortune in the War of 1812 and before, I think they just were not, they inherited money and were not great businessmen. We have Samuel Hamm, kind of the most dramatic failure of the time. He had made lots of money in the up and down periods between 1790 and 1809. Once the war started, a lot of his ties were with England. And once the war started and commerce was cut off, he was ruined. He had built a huge house, 3-story house out, it's where the traffic circle is now, and it was later lived in by Levi Woodbury. And he opened this, the house was started in 1809, finished in 1813, and he had this big party for all his friends and neighbors, and immediately after the party went up and hanged himself in an upper floor. So that's kind of the most dramatic of the failures. And then we have Benjamin Floyd, who is a more ordinary person. He's a bookbinder. Lynn Crocker is going to give a talk about him at the end of July. And he goes through several different bookbinding shops in the time. And he finally, this business is so bad that he signs up to be on a privateer. The privateer he signs up to be on is the Portsmouth. And both privateers, Portsmouth and Mars, at the end of the war, a lot of local mechanics and shopkeepers signed up to be crew members on those privateers, and those were both lost. So you had and then you had lots of women and children. Benjamin Floyd's wife and young children had to appeal for aid, sell off all of his belongings. I mean, it was not a good time for those. You did have other businessmen, however. So we had people like that definitely often died in this war period. And then you have businessmen who it was just not good for them, and they had various ways of coping with that. Thomas Morton was about the only crockery merchant in town. Thomas Morton owned the brick house that's attached to the Discover Portsmouth Center, where Star Island is now. He built that house, tried to sell it from the day he built it. Finally did sell it in 1814. He moved his business to Boston. He said, forget Portsmouth. He wasn't from Portsmouth, and he had come here for opportunity, which didn't happen largely because of the war. Thomas Pickering Drown, who was a silversmith and was essentially went out of the silversmithing business, became the city clerk or the town clerk for Portsmouth, made money that way, and then he became a clerk in one of the banks, which was a good position at that time. And then eventually he moved with his elder son had gone to Philadelphia and married an umbrella heiress, and the whole family eventually moved down to Philadelphia and lived for several generations on the umbrella heiress's money. So there were ways of coping with it, and the message really is most of the, like James Runlett's investing in factories outside of Portsmouth. Thomas Morton goes to Boston. Thomas Pickering Drown stays in Portsmouth for quite a long time, but eventually does go to Philadelphia, and his children have gone to Philadelphia. So you have people from Portsmouth dispersing themselves in the years after the War of 1812. And even while you have some uptick in shipbuilding, the overall trend is downward. So this was kind of a turning point. Also, in the midst of the War of 1812, we have two other things that happened. One is the fire of 1813. We often talk about the fire of 1813, but we don't talk about it happening in the middle of a war. So the fire happens in a town that's already devastated by economic adversity, and then half of your business district burns down. And so we have the map here showing where the fires extended. And this is, we already had 1802 and 1806. They had a yellow fever epidemic in 1799 and a hurricane in 1804. And I am amazed that the newspaper articles are not more pessimistic than they are. It was not a good time for Portsmouth, the whole first 20 years of the 19th century. So we have the fire happening. 6 months after the fire happening, there is threat of invasion from the British. The British have been blockading, sailing up and down, and because they were building the 74 at the shipyard, it was thought that Portsmouth was a really good, likely target for the British to invade. And had the weather been a little bit more in their favor, the invasion might have happened. So we have the militia called out. The militia, they come first early in the year, and then they come back in August. So you've got half your city burned down, and you have 3,000 militiamen in town. And I just cannot imagine how bad that might have been. I mean, obviously the militiamen are causing some business because they have to eat, but they're still, and you're fearing for invasion. William Neal, his friends write to him, well, you probably only have to move your store goods a mile because the invasion's only going to be along the river. So people are really thinking about moving their goods out of their stores inland. And exactly what happened is that it got to be winter, and the British went back to Halifax, so that in November the militia went away again. But we have a number of the militia rolls, thanks to Hollis Broderick, who's collected these, and Elaine Taft, who has a recruiting poster for the militia that matches one of our militia rolls. So we have Colonel Loring recruiting people in Concord to come to defend the seacoast. And this was known as the New Hampshire Detached Militia, which meant it could be detached to be part of the federal force. However, the federal government refused to provide officers and supplies for the militia because, well, actually, they refused to provide supplies because New Hampshire's governor refused to let federal officers command it. So the federal government wasn't going to have any power over this militia. It was totally under the command, really, of New Hampshire people. So they were at Fort Constitution. They were at the old Fort Washington on Pierce Island. They had a barracks at the Rope Walk. And I think it's the old Rope Walk that was down closer to Prescott Park as opposed to the Rope Walk that is on the map over here. And they built a new barracks out of the plains where the baseball field is now. So they had militia kind of stationed all over. They had to send people, militia people, to Fort McClary, which is in Maine, because Massachusetts wouldn't send anybody to defend Fort McClary. So you have the militia, kind of surrounding, waiting for the British to invade. But they don't, and so eventually they go away. But it must have been a really upsetting summer, trying to rebuild Portsmouth and then have the militia descend upon you. So it's, so I think that is the end. I mean, leaving you with the militia attacking. Portsmouth did survive with the War of 1812, obviously, and we have Ichabod Rollins over here, a little portrait from the New Hampshire Historical Society, and a manifest from the ship Hantonia, where Ichabod Rollins basically spent the War of 1812 in Gothenburg, Sweden, because they got blocked. Essentially, he couldn't get back. His ship was in Gothenburg because it had been in a storm. It had to go there to be refitted, and he ended up spending time there. And then it was one of the last ships to leave Portsmouth in 1812, and it was the first ship to come back. It had a cargo of iron, and came back in early 1815. So peace at last. I'll be happy to take questions. I hope I wasn't too disorganized. Yes.
Since goods were restricted from England from coming in,
yeah.
Did that give an impetus for the manufacturing climate
it did.
In the United States?
It did.
And the development of the rivers
yes.
and waterways?
Domestic manufacturers. This is when you have all the little cotton factories popping up, far from where we grow cotton. You have, in the Portsmouth newspaper, there's advertised a patent loom. Hardly any weaving going on in Portsmouth. So that's when you get things going, Somersworth, Rollinsford developing, and then New Hampshire, the focus in New Hampshire eventually moves to Salem, Manchester, places like that have fast running water where you can develop the factories. And this is when you really do start to turn to the factory economy. And that might not have happened so fast if you hadn't had all the rules against importing goods. It would have happened, but it might not have been quite so fast. And that hurt Portsmouth, because Portsmouth is really not positioned to take part in that. We don't have any falling water, which you need for running a mill, and the Piscataqua River doesn't have a big enough hinterland to gather up enough to support a large amount of ships. So Portland becomes the northern New England port for lumber and Canadian access, and Boston and New York are the East Coast, the northeast coast ports.
But it helped develop the state of New Hampshire between the Merrimack.
Yeah, it helped. I mean, and New Hampshire was the only state in New England that had half of its people in favor of the war. In the rest of New England, the Federalists were all opposed to the war. And they did have an interesting, to try to defeat Madison, they had a peace candidate who was going to end the war, and they knew that they had to have a Republican candidate. The Federalist candidate had no chance of winning. And in the election, the peace candidate Clinton did get a sizable amount of votes, and the Federalist candidate, Rufus King, only got 5 electoral votes. So we had, and Madison got reelected, was the outcome. And here I have some ads about the different elections and how, and if you think politics is nasty now, you should read some of the things they were saying about each other in 1812. I mean, in 1813, and New Hampshire's governor was only elected for a one-year term then, so he went through this every year. And you have, you know, like Governor Plummer's people calling Gilman that he should be, that for one sentence it says he's an imbecile, another sentence said he's way too old and he should go home where he long since. They're really nasty. Libelous, yes.
Sandra, three questions. Stop me when you want to.
Okay.
One, wasn't trade with Canada trade with Great Britain?
Yes.
So we couldn't trade with...
Right, that's why the trade from Halifax to Eastport was illegal.
Right. What happened to the crews when a privateer went out? You said they brought the ships back.
Right.
They didn't just take the goods.
Right.
What happened to the non-military crew?
They were prisoners,
They were.
and then they would exchange them.
Okay. So even though they were civilians.
Yeah, they would take them as prisoners and then exchange them.
And thirdly, I'm trying to get a better handle on the economics and therefore the politics of the time, 1807, 1812. We have the embargo,
Right.
which New England is saying, let's secede from the Union.
Well, they didn't say that until the end, until like
Really?
1814.
Well,
The
they
Hartford Convention was in 1814.
Thank you. They didn't want the embargo.
Oh, definitely not.
And then you said it stopped in 9.
Yeah.
But they still were prohibited.
Well, it was
trade,
replaced by the Non-Intercourse Act,
which I don't remember.
which, well, it's like, you could then trade with people who were not prohibiting trade with us. So Britain was still prohibiting trade, so we ended up not being able to trade with Britain. So there were times...
Or France, right? Because they were in...
and they were fighting each other, right. But we could trade with Denmark, we could trade with Russia, we could trade with Germany. But during the embargo, we couldn't trade with anybody.
So there was an easing of
Yes,
tension.
an
in
easy,
9, 12.
and there was some trade going on with England, and it had to do, I mean, they kept passing new rules every year, because there was this window in 1808, and 1810, where people were trading with England legally, and then it was illegal again. So,
I see. Which is why the revitalized anger in the
yes,
war, why the war
right,
starts.
and the impressment of sailors, and but in reality, we know that the British were right about some of this. If you have Richard Fletcher Dunn with his little certificate saying he was born in Pennsylvania, and we know he was born in England, and the British would get on these ships, on the U.S. Navy ships, and say, well, these people have English accents. They obviously were born in England. Now, it was the failure of the British to recognize that you could change your citizenship. Their view was, born in England, you're an English citizen forever and ever. And people like Dunn had come to America to become citizens of the United States. But if we know that he's one instance of a person who had an illegal certificate, there probably were plenty. And the British were probably partly right in taking these, in thinking these were British citizens.
Very clear, thanks.
Yes.
You know I'm going to bring up the Canadian side of this.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because we often forget that the maritime provinces suffered just as much as we did here and had the same kind of privateers going out. So if you go up to Newfoundland, you will find a heck of a lot of cannon dating back to the War of 1812 because our privateers went up there and preyed on fishing boats as well as the merchant ships. And the people were terrified that our privateers were going to devastate their communities. So they actually have mounted cannons still along the East Coast. And there's a little book out on privateering in Nova Scotia. And they tell the same story of one of the privateers that was captured here, or captured by a Portsmouth ship, brought into Portsmouth, and speaking about what they did with the crew, they were paraded through the downtown of Portsmouth in chains, vilified, spat upon, all of that. And of course the Canadians are saying, what horrible people those United States citizens are to treat our seamen like this. And we're seeing the opposite side of it. We're seeing a crew that was very successful in its depredations against us, getting their just desserts being paraded through the streets of Portsmouth. So it's interesting to see the two sides.
The two sides, and if you, I was in Sackett's Harbor last weekend, and the battlefield where the Americans successfully defended Sackett's Harbor, which is on Lake Ontario. And they're sort of, they give the Canadian view as well as because it's so close to Canada. And they said, well, the Americans say they won the war, and the Canadians know they won the war. The Canadians are actually much more, and there were several Canadians at the conference I went to, which was about weaving, not about the War of 1812, but several Canadians who are like, they're having the celebrations about the War of 1812 far more in Canada than here. And the Canadians are very proud that they were not conquered and that the War of 1812 they view as a real success. Now, most of these Canadians had been American loyalists. So it was very much, there's a book by Alan Taylor that talks about the Civil War of 1812, which is a very good book. I mean, that is mostly talking about the province known as Upper Canada and Upper and New York State and a little west of there. So, and the real losers in the War of 1812 between Canada and the United States were the Native Americans that we sort of forget about totally. Yes?
Can you shed any light on the two cannons at the front door of the Athenaeum from Oliver Hazard Perry's ships in Lake Erie?
Richard can. How did they get here?
Well, all I know is that they lived in the garden of John Pierce House here on Hamilton Square, and they're called cannonades because they're small scale. And they were presumably brought back from the battle on Lake Erie.
By the Pierces?
Either by the Pierces or somebody that they knew.
They might have been at the Navy Yard, brought to the Navy and then given, and then the Pierces got them.
But we don't know because, unfortunately, all of John Pierce's papers burned up in one of those fires. He had his office sort of around the corner on Market Street from where the Athenaeum is, and so when that building burned down before the Athenaeum was built, all of that went. Anyway, it sat in the gardens until, I'm saying maybe the 1850s or so, which is when they came over and planted
At the
upside
Athenaeum.
down at the Athenaeum, yeah.
Thanks.
And they've been there ever since.
Any more questions?
I have a little tiny question. What did the Canadians call this war? Did they call it the same thing we call it?
Yeah. Now, I'm not sure what they called it then, but now they call it the War of 1812.
Okay,
Yeah.
When we tried to invade them.
Exactly.
that's right.
I mean, talk about Washington fantasies. You know, of course they'll want to be conquered by us.
They're right north.
5440 or 5.
Yeah. And the Alan Taylor book is quite good on talking about why the Canadians wouldn't want to be part of us, again, especially in Upper Canada, that the British Empire kind of changed its view on how to treat its colonies, and they wanted strong central control, so no more Massachusetts legislatures in Canada. And they also gave free land and low or no taxes. And all these Americans who had stayed here, a lot of them had stayed here during the Revolution, and New York State was having lots of taxes to pay for the Revolution, and they said, well, we're going to go to Canada and get free land and no taxes. So much for liberty.
Thank you.
And tour the house and see what, the other things. We have a new John Paul Jones arrangement